Thank you so much, Shirley, for this introduction. And let me just share my screen. Okay, so I think we're set now. Everyone sees my image and the sound is on?
Yes, all is good.
Great. Yes, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much for organizing this truly amazing conference. I have enjoyed it so much, and I have already learned so many things that I will take with me. So as you mentioned, I am part of the Lund University Critical Animal Studies Network. So I have just provided here a link to our Facebook page, which looks like this. And also, I just wanted to say that if anyone is interested here in critical animal studies, we do have this introductory course every spring semester. And you can easily find that if you just Google Lund University Critical Animal Studies, and there you can read about admissions and so on. And you're also very welcome to get in touch with me if you're interested in learning more about this. So for my presentation here today, this is based on my PhD research, which concerns the problems of how mainstream law and politics advocate care and protection for animals. In particular, I focus on what I call the regime of care promoted as animal welfare when it comes to farmed animals. And by this regime of care, I refer to how animal welfare constitute a specific mode of rule or management in accordance with common farming practices. And as part of this more overarching research topic, I include a study based on fieldwork research where I visit different farmed animal sanctuaries in Denmark. Unfortunately, I cannot show you any images from the particular places that I have visited today due to reasons of research ethics, which prevents me from disclosing the exact places that I have visited. I assume that most of you here knows about farmed animal sanctuaries, and we have also had other presenters mentioning the work they do. But just to offer a very brief and generic definition, farmed animal sanctuaries are places that are intended on the rescue and care for formerly farmed animals. And as I write here, farmed animal sanctuaries strive to provide a permanent home for rescued farmed animals where they can live together with other members of their species and engage in species-typical behavior that they would otherwise be denied. Perhaps you could say that the sanctuaries are places where the chicken can scratch in the dirt and the pigs can wallow in the mud. But I also would like to say that I hesitate a bit with this kind of definitions, that this also risks undermining the experiences of the non-human animals themselves at these places, which are very important to address. And also it's very important to remember that farmed animal sanctuaries are quite diverse in terms of how these places are run. Are they run by professionals or volunteers? Are they public or not? What kind of conditions are offered, and how do they just basically organize the everyday life and care? In general, farmed animal sanctuaries are said to emerge during the 1980s. The first official farmed animal sanctuary was founded in 1986 in the US, and it's named Farm Sanctuary. And here I have included a picture from there from a rescued pig who enjoys a pumpkin at the Farm Sanctuary in New York. And this photo is taken by Joanne MacArthur, and her work was already mentioned here. But I just wanted to say that if you're interested in learning more, of course, you can go and look at her work in documenting the efforts of farmed animal sanctuaries. And also I would recommend to look into Patrice Jones and the work they do at Vine Sanctuary in Vermont. And I know that you can find some of her talks on YouTube. Great, but so what initially set me on the track of looking into farmed animal sanctuaries had to do with the kind of caregiving provided at the sanctuaries and how they confront the limited remit of care provided by the general framework of animal protection, particularly when it comes to farmed animals. Caregiving at farmed animal sanctuaries provide an alternative way to both individually and collectively respond to the situation of this particular group of animals without falling into the very restricted and anthropocentric ideas such as related to animal welfareism and mainstreamed ideas about reducing suffering. Instead, the farmed animal sanctuaries offer a much more holistic image of life at the sanctuary, or of animal life in general. And in this relation, what I understand by anthropocentrism is most obviously has to do with this kind of very utility-based model for animal welfare, but also the more subtle and underlying ways in which the bodily and affective and phenomenological experiences of non-human animals are disregarded or diminished. And moreover, I noticed how anthropocentrism works as a way to sustain the harmful and violent human-animal relations, such has already been addressed in this conference. So during last fall, I started to visit some different farmed animal sanctuaries in Denmark. And it was through encountering the reality of these sanctuaries that I really started to think of caregiving as not only connected to developing an alternative kind to the regime of care that I just discussed, but also as an everyday activity of resisting these politics. In previous research and in the movement in general, farmed animal sanctuaries has often been associated with the potential for advocating animal rights and liberation, for doing anti-species education, and also, very importantly, to explore different aspects of interspecies communities, such as Eva Meyer mentioned earlier in her presentation. And all of these perspectives are equally important. But in my research and also in the presentation here today, I focus mainly on the role of farmed animal sanctuaries as places of resisting and challenging the law's violent regimes of care, because this is something that I find to require much more attention. So, as I mentioned, I draw on this field research, which is conducted in Denmark, and farmed animal sanctuaries in this context is quite recent and only emerging phenomena. There only exist a few places. Some of them have maybe a few members of one species, others have up to 80, 90 individual non-human animals. So one particularly fascinating aspect of farmed animal sanctuaries are how they present an alternative image of multi-species life. Often farmed animal sanctuaries are situated within rural and agricultural landscapes, but they really do present a radically different way of doing human-animal relations. So this is particularly perhaps evident in a Danish context. For those of you who might not be aware, Denmark is a very small country, but with an extensive animal production, and also until recently, the world's largest mink farming industry. So when it comes to production of pig, for example, Denmark has the world's largest production, and it's when you measure per capita, and also Denmark takes the second place when it comes to agricultural land use. In Denmark, some 60% of the entire land is used on farming, of which 80% is used on the production of animal feed. So as these numbers indicate, farming plays a very essential role in Denmark when it comes to explaining the extremely deprived condition of fauna and flora. At the same time, this enormous and extensively intensified farming industry are also a significant cause behind Denmark's difficulty of complying with the Paris Agreement, even though the Danish government has, on paper, committed to reach a 70% reduction of greenhouse gases emissions before 2030 when compared to the 1990s levels. So if you imagine passing through the countryside in Denmark, and this is just to give you some images here, you quickly get like an understanding of how this animal production has really impacted life in rural areas. And when I started to visit these farmed animal sanctuaries, I was precisely met by this stark contrast between the multi-species life taking place at the sanctuaries and then these endless pastures of monocultural crops and large-scale farms, or more adequately factories. So even though farmed animal sanctuaries at first sight might recall to memory the idea of traditional old-fashioned small farm with a few members of different species, they are really places that offer a radically different kind of flourishing beyond life at the farm. So at these farmed animal sanctuaries, the human caregivers aim to provide a permanent home and interfere as little as possible in the life of the non-humans. As one of the sanctuary caregivers told me, I like the idea of how the pigs can walk into the forest and pretend that humans don't exist. And of course, the underlying assumption here being that humans have done so much harm to other animals. So in that sense, they would be much better off without us. But obviously, when it comes to this particular group of animals who has been bred for profit, they remained very dependent on human care throughout their life when they come at the sanctuary. And at the sanctuaries, this kind of caregiving include everything from feeding, regular health checks, cleaning and trimming of the hooves and claws. It also implies predator proofing and all kinds of repairs of the buildings and so on. And importantly, it's also it's also important to note that at the sanctuary, sanctuary life also involves some multi-species care. So care is not only provided by the human caregivers. Human caregivers are also receiving care, and most importantly, there is the care that take place between the different non-human individuals, the residents at the place, the pig siblings that care for each other, the chickens, the horses, the ducks, and so on, the mother cow who care for her baby calf. At the sanctuary, basically, animals are not considered utilities and commodities. When I started to visit some of these farmed animal sanctuaries in Denmark, I wanted to learn about the relationship between the human caregivers and the non-human residents. And I wanted to look into this transformation of their life after they had been removed from the institutionalized violence and come to the sanctuary. And importantly, as was also mentioned in the introduction to my talk, I was also interested in how, in drawing to attention this very difficult task of caring for this particular group of animals, who has been both physically and psychologically been traumatized by their experiences from before. So if we think about what kind of alternative images these sanctuaries present, we have to importantly pay attention to the fact that these places are not utopias. Life at the sanctuaries is not ideal. Although some of these, and many perhaps of these individuals might recover from some of the trauma, there's no certainty about it. And the human caregivers also are faced with various dilemmas, having to perform reproductive control and also to euthanize animals. So farmed animal sanctuaries, they take some essential steps in removing the specific or particular individuals from the context of agricultural control and management of non-human life, but they're not completely able to disrupt the framework of animal welfareism. And this sense, they also remain embedded within the normative regime intended on industrial production and animal capital. So returning to the title of my presentation, Challenging Laws, Violent Regimes of Care, I wanted to highlight a few examples of how sanctuary making is confronted by and also confronts the law. Most obviously, and the sanctuaries are in many ways prevented from creating the kind of multi-species community due to restrictive zoning laws that specifies the number of animals that can be kept for non-commercial purposes in urban and rural zones or land areas. These are laws that restrict the certain species and breeds and even sexes. As far as I'm concerned, these kind of zoning laws exist in all parts of the world. Secondly, in challenging the common ideas and practices of domination and animal exploitation, farmed animal sanctuaries are also confronted with the very specific violent regime of care enacted through the law. This violent regime of care, as I suggest to call it, might recognize animals as living beings, and in that sense, they are seen as more than just commodities, but they still promote the idea that a good animal life can be defined by a life without this unnecessary suffering. So as you're all quite aware, animal protecting under this specific regime becomes a matter of ensuring minimum requirements, such as access to food and water, and perhaps some material to play with. It also includes preventing or banning certain harmful practices. But for the sanctuaries that insist on the inherent value of each individual animal's life, they're confronted with a very different view of what animal well-being entails through the law. And in particular, this comes to the fore when with regards to instances where official animal welfare and health inspectors consider certain caregiving practices at the sanctuaries to be in conflict with legal regulations. This can be potentially just minor offenses concerning keeping a proper register of all the animals, but it can also imply more fundamental disagreements about whether the animals should be allowed to grow old, even if they have some physical problems. So in this sense, farm animal sanctuaries are confronted with a paradox that makes their effort to provide lifelong care for animals simultaneously a potential act of cruelty and violation of animal welfare laws as they look like today. And because animal protection and the framework of animal welfare are embedded in this specific agricultural setting, I argue that an essential aspect of the ethical doings of farmed animal sanctuaries become to challenge the very same legal framework that has been put in place in order to protect the animals. Additionally, perhaps on a more everyday basis, the sanctuaries are confronted with the limited remit of care provided by the professional veterinarians who the sanctuaries depend on for regular health examinations and checks up, but also when an individual non-human animal is sick or injured. Many of the sanctuary caregivers told me about how difficult it can be to find a proper veterinarian who can provide the adequate treatment. And often these veterinarians, they come and they suggest euthanasia instead of actually treating the animals. as they would with if this had been a dog who suffered from the same condition. And I think these kind of examples, they remind us of the urgent need to really rethink multi-species life in the 21st century, to borrow from Marine's framing of the problem earlier today. So in connecting with the overarching theme of the conference, imagining futures for human-animal relation, I will bring an important point to mind by referring to Timothy Peshuat, a quote by Timothy Peshuat, where he highlights the urgency to unimagine sanctuaries as sacred utopias and instead to rethink them as sites of potential rupture and resistance. In other words, farm animal sanctuary importantly disrupt and call to question the silent acceptance of human domination, and they lay out a different path of how care should be fought and practiced across species boundaries. And on this point, I recall a brief sentence from Katrin Gillespie in her book, The Cow with the Ear Tag, where she states that sanctuaries have the potential to be sites where care is radically reimagined. And I think I will stop my presentation here to also allow some questions and comments from you. And I'm also very happy if this discussion we will have now is also occasion for some of you who might know the work of particular farmed animal sanctuaries or have been involved to also share your view on these matters that I have discussed here.